This is going to be an experimental video. I know, historically speaking, experimental videos have not always had the desired effects on this channel. Roll clips of M.V.P.Knight doing experimental videos. It takes 2 holidays that were built off of the sharing and interchanging of culture, and then it said don't share or interchange culture, which I find ironic, and I don't know what the heck I'm supposed to do with any of these finger trigger button thingies. No! But you know what? Better to have a few bad ideas every once in a while than to get used to doing the same thing every time. So what is this experimental video going to be? What I'm going for is sort of like a hybrid of book review, audiobook, and the book version of a Let's Play. A Let's Read, if you will. I'm going to be reading the original Peter Pan, or Peter Pan and Wendy, which is a public domain book. Well, the short version is it's public domain. It feels like I never get a straight answer when I look it up, but my understanding is the book is public domain, at least in America. It might be that the stage play is copyrighted and the book is only copyrighted in Britain, or maybe the book's not copyrighted anywhere, but I'm making a video with the book in America, so we're not going to get in trouble. And as I've all but spelled out, this is my first time doing this format, so this might be interesting. And I'll be showing you the illustrations as we go. It's kind of like that introductory poster. And there's another one right at the beginning, just for the sake of showing you all the illustrations. I've listened to an audiobook of Peter Pan a long time ago, but I really absorb it better when I'm reading, so there might be a lot of things I've forgotten or didn't pay attention to. Chapter 1. Peter breaks through. All children except one grow up. They soon know that they will grow up, and the way Wendy knew was this. One day, when she was 2 years old, she was playing in the garden, and she plucked another flower and ran with it to her mother. I suppose she must have looked rather delightful, for Mrs. Darling put her hands to her heart and cried, "Oh, why can't you remain like this forever?" This was all that passed between them on the subject, but henceforth Wendy knew that she must grow up. You always know after you are 2. 2 is the beginning of the end. Well, that's an early end. Of course they live at 14, and until Wendy came, her mother was the chief one. She was a lovely lady, with a romantic mind and such a sweet, mocking mouth. Her romantic mind was like the tiny boxes, one within the other, that came from the puzzling East. Is that offensive? If that was meant to be offensive, that better have been directed at China, because if they directed that at Japan, we're gonna have a problem. However many you discover, there is always one more, and her sweet, mocking mouth had one kiss on it that Wendy could never get, though there it was, perfectly conspicuous, in the right-hand corner. The way Mr. Darling won her was this. The many gentlemen who had been boys when she was a girl discovered simultaneously that they loved her, and they all ran to her house to propose to her, except Mr. Darling, who took a cab and nipped it in first. And so he got her. What? Wait, so dozens of boys tried to propose to her, but he got her because he got there first? So she would have married literally anyone else if they had gotten to her first? Was that how things were back then? He got all of her except the innermost box and the kiss. He never knew about the box, and in time he gave up trying for the kiss. So she only married him because he asked first, and she never kissed him? Wow, this is a doomed to fail marriage. I didn't remember their marriage being so doomed to fail. I mean, in the animated movie, he could blow his top sometimes, but she could handle him pretty well. It was like ultimately a healthy marriage, I thought. Wendy thought Napoleon could have got it, but I can picture him trying and then going off in a passion, slamming the door. Mr. Darling used to boast to Wendy that her mother not only loved him but respected him. Does she respect him? I mean, with a lady like this, I guess respect is a lot to ask. He was one of those deep ones who know about stocks and shares. Of course, no one really knows, but he quite seemed to know, and he often said stocks were up and shares were down in a way that would have made any woman respect him. I don't know. Ladies, would you respect me if I started talking about stocks and bonds? If the answer is yes, I have some research to do. Mrs. Darling was married in white, and at first she kept the books perfectly, almost gleefully, as if it were a game. Not so much as a Brussels sprout was missing, but by and by whole cauliflowers dropped out, and instead of them there were pictures of babies without faces. She drew them when she should have been tarting up. They were Mrs. Darling's guesses. Wendy came first, then John, then Michael. For a week or two after Wendy came, it was doubtful whether they would be able to keep her, as she was another mouth to feed. Now back then, if you could only afford to have a dog as a maid, you were really in trouble. Mr. Darling was frightfully proud of her, but he was very honorable, and he sat on the edge of Mrs. Darling's bed. Mrs. Darling's bed is not also Mr. Darling's bed? Holding her hand and calculating expenses, while she looked at him imploringly. She wanted to risk it, come what might, but that was not his way. His way was a pencil and piece of paper, and if she confused him with suggestions, he had to begin at the beginning again. Now don't interrupt, he would beg of her. I'm sorry, I should be doing my Mr. Darling voice. Now don't interrupt, he would beg her. I have £1.17 here and 2 and 6 out at the office. I can cut them in my coffee in the office. What? You can cut these pounds in the office. Okay. Say 10 shillings, making 2, 9, and 6 with your 18, and 3 makes 3, 9, 7, with 5 knots not in my Quicket book. Make 8, 9, 7. Make 897, who is that moving? 897, dot and carry 7, don't speak my own. And the pounds you lent to that man who came to the door, quiet child. Dot and carry child, there you've done it. Did I say 997? Yes, I said 997. The question is, can we try it for a year on 997? Of course we can, George, she cried. But she was prejudiced in Wendy's favor. Prejudice in favor? Hang on. Looking up the definition of prejudice, see even if it can be in favor. That has two different definitions. One is preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. So it could be that her liking towards Wendy is not based on reason or actual experience. And the second definition is harm or injury that results or may result from some action or judgment. But she had a predisposed opinion that was not based on actual experience or reason in Wendy's favor, and he was really the grander character of the two. I can definitely see George being the grander character of the two, since she marries whoever asks first, and she doesn't kiss, and according to the movie, he's the funny one. I mean, never mind that Mr. Darling wasn't sure if he wanted to keep the kids. Remember mumps? He warns her almost threateningly, and off he went again. Mumps, £1, that is what I have put down, but I dare say it will be more like 30 shillings. Don't speak. Measles, 1.5, German measles, 1.5, German measles, half a measles, 1.5, German measles, half a guinea, makes 2, 15, 6. Don't waggle your finger. Whooping cough, say 15 shillings. And so it went on, and it added up differently each time. But at last, Wendy just got through, with mumps reduced to 12, 6, and 2 kinds of measles treated as one. There was the same excitement over John, and Michael had an even narrower squeak. But both were kept. And soon you might have seen the 3 of them going in a row to Miss Folsom's kindergarten school, accompanied by their nurse. All 3 of them were in kindergarten at the same time? Maybe kindergarten had a bigger age range back then. Also accompanied by their nurse. Was their nurse not a dog in the original? We'll see soon enough, I guess. Mrs. Darling loved to have everything just so, and Mr. Darling had a passion for being exactly like his neighbors. So, of course, they had a nurse. As they were poor, owing to the amount of milk the children drank, the nurse was a prim Newfoundland dog named Nana. Oh, okay, so it was a dog. I have confirmation it was always a dog. Who had belonged to no one in particular until the Darlings engaged her. She had always thought children important, however, and the Darlings had become acquainted with her in Kensington Gardens, where she had spent most of her spare time peeping into perambulators, and was much hated by careless nursemaids, who she followed to their homes and complained of to their mistresses. She proved to be quite a treasure of a nurse. How thorough she was at bathe time, and up any moments of the night if one of her charges had the slightest cry. Of course her kennel was in the nursery. She had a genius for knowing when a cough is a thing to have patience with, and when it needs stocking around your throat. She believed to her last day in old-fashioned remedies like rhubarb leaf, and made sounds of contempt over all this newfangled talk about germs and so on. Nana is on the wrong side of history. It was a lesson in propriety to have her escorting the children to school, walking sedately by their side when they were well behaved, inviting them back in line if they strayed. On John's footer days, she never once forgot his sweater, and she usually carried an umbrella in her mouth in case of rain. There's a room in the basements of Mrs. Folsom's school where the nurses wait. They sat on forms while Nana lay on the floor, but that was the only difference. They affected to ignore her as an inferior social status to themselves, and she despised their light talk. She resented visits to the nursery from Mrs. Darling's friends, but if they did come, she first whipped off Michael's pinafore and put him into the one with blue braiding, and smoothed out Wendy and made a dash at John's hair. No nursery could possibly have been conducted more correctly, and Mr. Darling knew it. Yet he sometimes wondered uneasily whether the neighbors talked. He had his position in the city to consider, the position that doesn't pay him well enough for him to have a nurse that's not a dog, that position. Anna also troubled him in another way. He had sometimes a feeling that she did not admire him. "I know she admires you tremendously, George," Mrs. Darling would assure him, and then she would sign to his children to be specially nice to father. Lovely dances followed, in which the only other servants There's an other servant? Lovely dances followed, in which the only other servant, Lisa, was sometimes allowed to join. Such a midget she looked in her long skirts and maid's cap, though she had sworn when engaged that she would never see 10 again. The gaiety of those romps. And gayest of all was Mrs. Darling. Gay meant something different back then. Who would pirouette so wildly that all you could see of her was the kiss, and then if you had dashed at her you might have got it. You would have gotten it, but not Mr. Darling, after all these years and 3 kids. There never was a simpler, happier family until the coming of Peter Pan. A simpler family than the one with a dog for a nurse, and a happier one than the one that never kisses. What? Mrs. Darling first heard of Peter when she was tidying up her children's minds. It is the nightly custom of every good mother, after her children are asleep, to rummage in their minds and put things straight for next morning, repacking into their proper places the many articles that wander during the day. If you could keep awake, but of course you can't, you would... I could have kept awake for a while, I guess. You would see your own mother doing this, and you would find it very interesting to watch her. It is quite like tidying up drawers. You would see her on her knees, I expect, lingering humorously over some of your contents, wondering where on earth you had picked this up, making discoveries, sweet and not so sweet, pressing this to her cheeks as if it were as nice as a kitten, and hurriedly stowing that out of sight. When you wake in the morning, the naughtiness and evil passions with which you went to bed have been folded up small and placed at the bottom of your minds, and on the top, beautifully aired, are spread out your prettier thoughts, ready for you to put on. I don't know whether you have ever seen a map of a person's mind. Doctors sometimes draw maps of other parts of you, and your own map can become intensely interesting, but catches them trying to draw a map of a child's mind, which is not only confused, but keeps going round all the time. There are zigzag lines on it, just like your temperature on a card, and these are probably roads in the island, for Neverland is always more or less an island, with astonishing splashes of color here and there, and coral reefs, and rakish-looking craft in the offing. And savages, savages is just a term for those who are less civilized, and lonely lairs, and gnomes who are mostly tailors. That's an offensive stereotype about gnomes. And caves through which a river runs, and princes with 6 elder brothers in a hut going fast to decay, and one very small old lady with a hooked nose. It would be an easy map if that were all, but there is a first day at school, religion, fathers, the round pond, needlework, murders, hangings, herbs that take the dative, chocolate pudding day, getting into braces, say 99, 3 pence for pulling out your tooth to yourself, and so on. And either these are parts of the island or they are another map showing through, and it is all rather confusing, especially as nothing will stand still. Of course, the Neverlands vary a good deal. John's, for instance, was a lagoon with flamingos flying over it, which John was shooting, while Michael, who was very small, had a flamingo with lagoons flying over it. John lived in a boat turned upside down on the sands. Michael in a wigwam. Wendy in a house of leaves deftly sewn together. John had no friends. Michael had friends at night. Wendy had a pet wolf forsaken by its parents. But on the whole, the Neverlands have a family resemblance, and if they stood still in a row, you could say of them that they had each other's nose, and so forth. On these magic shores, children at play are forever beating their coracles. Coracles? Who too have been there, we can still hear the sounds of the surf, though we shall land no more. Of all delectable islands, the Neverland is the snuggest and most compact. Not large and sprawling, with tedious distances between one adventure and another, but nicely crammed. When you play at it by day with the chairs and tablecloth, it is not in the least alarming, but in the 2 minutes before you go to sleep, it becomes very real. That is why there are night lights. Occasionally in her travels through her children's minds, Mrs. Darling found things she could not understand, and of these quite the most perplexing was the word Peter. She knew of no Peter, and yet he was here and there in John and Michael's minds, while Wendy's began to scramble all over him. The name stood out in bolder letters than any of the other words, and as Mrs. Darling gazed, she felt that it had an oddly cocky appearance. Yes, he is rather cocky, Wendy admitted with regret. Her mother had been questioning her. But who is he, my pet? He is Peter Pan, mother. At first Mrs. Darling did not know. But after thinking back into her childhood, she had remembered a Peter Pan who was said to live with the fairies. There were odd stories about him, as that when children died, he went part of the way with them, so that they should not be frightened. She had believed in him all the time, but now that she was married and full of sense, she quite doubted whether there was any such person. Besides, she said to Wendy, he would be grown up by this time. Oh no, he isn't grown up, Wendy assured her confidently, and he is just my size. She felt that he was her size in both mind and body. She didn't know how she knew, she just knew it. So it seems like in this version, Peter Pan has been talked about by a lot of children for a long time, before the Darling family heard of him. In the animated movie, I was assuming that the only reason that the Darling children had heard about Peter Pan was because her dad had gone to Neverland when he was a child, because that was something that was hinted at the end of the movie. Mrs. Darling consulted Mr. Darling, but he smiled pooh-pooh. Mark my words, he said. It is some nonsense Nana has been putting in their heads. Just the sort of idea a dog would have. Leave it alone and it will blow over. Stupid dogs are always talking about such nonsense to children. But it would not blow over, and soon the troublesome boy gave Mrs. Darling quite a shock. Children have the strangest adventures without being troubled by them. For instance, they may remember to mention, a week after the event happened, that when they were in the wood they had met their dead father, and had a game with him. It was in this casual way that Wendy one morning made a disquieting revelation. Some leaves of a tree had been found in the nursery floor, which certainly weren't there when the children went to bed, and Mrs. Darling was puzzled over them when Wendy said with a tolerant smile, "I do believe in Peter Pan again." "Whatever do you mean?" "It is so naughty of him not to wipe his feet," Wendy said, sighing. She was a tidy child. She explained in quite a matter-of-fact way that she thought Peter sometimes came to the nursery in the night and sat on the floor of her bed and played on his pipes to her. And no one was woken up by that? Unfortunately, she never woke, so she didn't know how she knew, she just knew. And no one ever heard that? What nonsense you talk, Precious. No one can get into the house without knocking. "I think he comes in by the window," she said. "My love, it is 3 floors up. Were not the leaves at the foot of the window, Mother?" It was quite true. The leaves had been found very near the window. Mrs. Darling did not know what to think, for it all seemed so natural to Wendy that he could not dismiss it by saying she had been dreaming. "My child," the mother cried, "why did you not tell me of this before?" "I forgot," Wendy said lightly. She was in a hurry to get her breakfast. Oh, surely she must have been dreaming. But on the other hand, there were the leaves. Mrs. Darling examined them very carefully. They were skeleton leaves, but she was sure they did not come from any tree that grew in England. She crawled at the floor, peering at it with a candle for marks of a strange foot. She rattled the poker up the chimney and tapped the walls. She let down a tape from the window to the pavement, and it was a sheer drop of 30 feet, without so much as a sprout to climb up by. All those stories about Peter Pan and they haven't heard that he can fly yet? Certainly Wendy had been dreaming. But Wendy had not been dreaming, as the very next night showed, the night on which the extraordinary adventures of these children may be said to have begun. On the night we speak of, all the children were once more in bed. It happened to be Nana's evening off, and Mrs. Darling had bathed them and sung to them till one by one they had let go her hand and slid away into the land of sleep. All were looking so safe and cozy that she smiled at her fears now, and sat down tranquilly by the fire to stew. All were looking so safe and cozy that she smiled at her fears now, and sat down tranquilly by the fire to sew. It was something for Michael, who on his birthday was getting into shirts. The fire was warm, however, and the nursery dimly lit by 3 night lights, and presently the sewing lay on Mrs. Darling's lap. Then her head nodded oh so gracefully. She was asleep. Looking at the 4 of them, Wendy and Michael over there, John here, and Mrs. Darling on the fire. There should have been a 4th nightlight. While she slept, she had a dream. She dreamt that the Neverlands had come too near, and that a strange boy had broken through from it. He did not alarm her, for she thought she had seen him before in the faces of many women who had no children. Perhaps he is to be found in the faces of some other mothers also. But in her dream, he had rent the film that obscures the Neverland, and she saw Wendy and John and Michael peeping through the gap. But while she was dreaming, the window of the nursery blew open, and a boy dropped on the floor. He was accompanied by a strange light no bigger than your fist, which darted about the room like a living thing, and I think it must have been this light that awakened Mrs. Darling. She started up with a cry and saw the boy, and somehow she knew at once that he was Peter Pan. If you or I or Wendy had been there, we should have seen that he was very like Mrs. Darling's kiss. What? He was a lovely boy, clad in skeleton leaves, and the juices that ooze out of the leaves. But the most entrancing thing about him was that he had all his first teeth. So just to recap, the eternal child Peter Pan is being described as like a kiss, lovely, juicy, and entrancing. When he saw she was a grown-up, he gnashed the little pearls at her. Chapter 2, The Shadow. Mrs. Darling screamed, and as if in answer to a bell, the door opened, and Nana entered, returning from an evening out. She growled and sprang at the boy, who leapt lightly through the window. Again Mrs. Darling screamed, this time in distress for him, for she thought he was killed. And she ran down into the streets to look for his little body, but it was not there. And she looked up, and in the black night she could see nothing but what she thought was a shooting star. She returned to the nursery and found Nana with something in her mouth, which proved to be the boy's shadow. As he leapt at the window, Nana had closed it quickly, too late to catch him. But his shadow had not had time to get out. Slam went to the window and snapped it off. You may be sure Mrs. Darling examined the shadow carefully, but it was quite the ordinary kind. An ordinary kind of shadow that separates from its person. Nana had no doubt of what was the best thing to do with the shadow. She hung it out at the window, meaning he is sure to come back for it. Let us put it where he can get it easily without disturbing the children. But unfortunately, Mrs. Darling could not leave it hanging out at the window. It looked so like the washing and lowered the whole tone of the house. Reading this so many years later, it's easy to figure out that he flew away, but back then, this is one of those things where everybody knows what's going on now, but back then there was a bit of mystery to it. We all know that Peter Pan flew off, and that's why he jumped out the window and his body wasn't found. But back then, if you're just reading this for the first time and never heard anything about it before, there's no indication up to this point that he could fly. It's sort of like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because everybody knows that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are the same person, but in the book that was actually a major plot twist near the end. She thought about showing it to Mr. Darling, but he was toting up winter greatcoats for John and Michael, with a wet towel around his head to keep his brain clear. That's how you prevent the aliens from rummaging through your thoughts the way your mother used to. And it seemed a shame to trouble him. Besides, she knew exactly what he would say. It all comes of having a dog for a nurse. She decided to roll the shadow up and put it away carefully in a drawer until a fitting opportunity came for telling her husband. Me. Not sure what that means. It just says, me. The opportunity came a week later on that never-to-be-forgotten Friday. Of course it was a Friday. I ought to have been specially careful on a Friday, she used to say afterwards to her husband, while perhaps Nana was on the other side of her, holding her hand. Oh no, Mr. Darling always said. I am responsible for it all. I, George Darling, did it. Mea culpa, mea culpa. He had had a classical education. They sat thus night after night, recalling that fatal Friday, until every detail of it was stamped into their brains, and came through on the other side like the faces on a bad coinage. If only I had not accepted that invitation to dine at 27, Mrs. Darling said. If only I had not poured my medicine into Nana's bowl, said Mr. Darling. If only I had pretended to like the medicine, was what Nana's wet eyes said. My liking for parties, George. My fatal gift of humor, dearest. My touchiness about trifles, my master and mistress. I'm guessing that's what Nana's eyes were saying. Then one or more of them would break down altogether. Nanette thought, it's true, they ought not to have had a dog for a nurse. Many a time it was Mr. Darling who put the handkerchief to Nana's eyes. That fiend, Mr. Darling would cry, and Nana's bark was the echo of it. But Mrs. Darling never upbraided Peter. There was something in the right-hand corner of her mouth that wanted to not call Peter names. Well, if he tried to sneak into your house, I think you're kind of justified in calling him names. They would sit there in the empty nursery, recalling fondly every smallest detail of the dreadful evening. It had begun so uneventfully, so preciously like 100 other evenings, with Nana putting on the water for Michael's bath and carrying him to it on her back. I won't go to bed, he had shouted, like one who still believed that he had the last word on the subject. I won't. Nana, it isn't 6 o'clock yet. Oh dear, I shan't love you any more, Nana. I tell you I won't be bathed. I won't. Then Mrs. Darling had come in, wearing her white evening gown. She had dressed early because Wendy so loved to see her in the evening gown, with the necklace George had given her. She was wearing Wendy's bracelet on her arm. She had asked for the loan of it. Wendy loved to lend her bracelet to her mother. She had found the two older children playing at being herself and her father on the occasion of Wendy's birth. And John was saying, I am happy to inform you, Mrs. Darling, that you are now a mother, in just such a tone as Mr. Darling himself may have used on the real occasion. Wendy had danced with joy, just as the real Mrs. Darling must have done. Then John was born, with the extra pump that he conceived due to the birth of a male, and Michael came from his bath to ask to be born also. But John said brutally that they did not want any more. Michael had nearly cried. Nobody wants me, he said. And of course the lady in the evening dress could not stand that. I do, she said. I so want a third child. Boy or girl? Asked Michael, not too hopeful. Boy. Then he had leapt into her arms. Such a little thing for Mr. and Mrs. Darling and Nana to recall now, but not so little if that was to be Michael's last night in the nursery. They go on with their recollections. "It was then that I rushed in like a tornado, wasn't it?" Mr. Darling would say, scorning himself. And indeed, he had been like a tornado. Perhaps there was some excuse for him. He too had been dressing for the party, and all had gone well for him until he came to his tie. It is an astonishing thing to have to tell, but this man, though he knew of stocks and shares, had no real mastery of his tie. Sometimes a thing yielded to him without a contest, but there were occasions when it would have been better for the house if he had swallowed his pride and used a made-up tie. "Why, what is the matter, father dear?" "Matter?" he yelled. He really yelled. "The tie! It will not tie!" He became dangerously sarcastic. "Not round my neck, round the bedpost. Oh yes, 20 times I have made it up round the bedpost, but round my neck, no. Oh dear no. Begs to be excused." He thought Mrs. Darling was not sufficiently impressed, and he went on sternly. "I warn you of this, mother, that unless this tie is round my neck, we won't go to the dinner tonight. And if we don't go to the dinner tonight, I'll never go to the office again. And if I don't go to the office again, you and I starve, and our children will be flung into the streets." So those few sentences are pretty much where the movie begins, after a bit of narration. I think they made the right call in taking out everything we've been through up until this point in the movie. I'm assuming that the play did as well. All we've gotten up until this point is some very troubling tidbits about the Darlings' marriage, and the not really mind-blowing story of how the shadow got into their room. I like how the movie streamlined things. Normally you say show, don't tell, but there are a few exceptions here and there where showing wouldn't be that interesting. And if you can tell in a timely manner like the movie did. Even then, Mrs. Darling was placid. "Let me try, dear," she said, and indeed that was what he had to ask her to do. And with her nice cool hands, she tied his tie for him, while the children stood around to see their fate decided. "You mean they're not sword fighting or treasure hunting? My childhood is ruined." Some men would have resented her being able to do it so easily, but Mr. Darling had far too fine a nature for that. He thanked her carelessly, at once forgot his rage, and in another moment was dancing around the room with Michael on his back. He forgot his rage and danced, but it was so much funnier when he stayed angry. "How wildly we romped," says Mrs. Darling, now recalling it. Says Mrs. Darling, now recalling the scene. Wait, is Mrs. Darling in the room with the author as he's writing this? So how does this work? "Our last romp," Mr. Darling groaned. "Oh, George, do you remember Michael suddenly said to me, 'How did you get to know me, mother?' I remember. They were rather sweet, don't you think, George? And they were ours. And now they are gone." The romp had ended with the appearance of Nana, and most unluckily, Mr. Darling collided against her, covering his trousers with hair. That's one of the reasons you should never own dogs, because they get hair all over your clothes. They were not only new trousers, but they were the first he had ever had with braid on them, and he had had to bite his lip to prevent the tears coming. Of course Mrs. Darling brushed him, but he had begun to talk again about its being a mistake to have a dog as a nurse. "George, Nana is a treasure, no doubt, but I have an uneasy feeling at times that she looks upon the children as puppies." "Oh no, dear one, I feel sure she knows they're Oh, I love this next line. "Oh no, dear one, I feel sure she knows they have souls." Because puppies do not have souls, remember that part. "I wonder," Mr. Darling said thoughtfully, "I wonder." It was an opportunity his wife felt for telling him about the boy. At first he pooh-poohed the story, but he became thoughtful when she showed him the shadow. "It is nobody I know," he said, examining it carefully, "but it does look a scoundrel." "We were still discussing it, you remember," says Mr. Darling. "When Nana came in with Michael's medicine. You will never carry the bottle in your mouth again, Nana, and it is all my fault." Again, are some of these sentences happening in present day? Strong man though he was, I thought he's in the room with you now as you write this, saying things in present tense, but anyway. Strong man though he was, there is no doubt that he had behaved rather foolishly over the medicine. If he had a weakness, it was for thinking that all his life he had taken medicine boldly. And so now, when Michael dodged the spoon in Nana's mouth, he had said reprovingly, "Be a man, Michael. Let this be a lesson to all about confusing people with the present and past tenses." Because it says, "and so now, when Michael dodged the spoon." I mean, you can use the word now to describe something when it's like now as in where we are in recounting the story. But what makes that confusing is that earlier there was some sentences put in present tense as if they were recalling the story from present day. So I've been introduced to the concept of present day as opposed to past tense. So when it says now, my mind goes to present tense, which turns out to not be accurate. So right after he said, "Be a man, Michael." Won't, Michael cried naughtily. Mrs. Darling left the room to get a chocolate for him, and Mr. Darling thought this showed want of firmness. "Mother, don't pamper him," he called after her. "Michael, when I was your age, I took the medicine without a murmur. I said, 'Thank you, kind parents, for giving me bottles to make me well.'" Didn't I say earlier that he poured his own medicine into Nana's bowl? He really thought this was true, and Wendy, who was now in her nightgown, believed it also, and she said to encourage Michael, "That medicine you sometimes take, Father, is much nastier, isn't it?" "Ever so much nastier," Mr. Darling said bravely, "and I would take it now as an example to you, Michael, if I hadn't lost the bottle." A likely story. He had not exactly lost it. He had climbed in the dead of night to the top of the wardrobe and hidden it there. Aha, he is a liar. What he did not know was that the faithful Lisa had found it and put it back on his washstand. "I know where it is, Father," Wendy cried, always glad to be of service. "I'll bring it." And she was off before he could stop her. Immediately his spirits sank in the strangest way. So much for being of a finer and or grander character. "John," he said, shuddering, "it's most beastly stuff. It's that nasty, sticky, sweet kind." Sweet is a bad kind of medicine? "It will soon be over, Father," John said cheerily, and then in rushed Wendy with the medicine in a glass. "I have been quick as I could," she panted. "You have been wonderfully quick," her father retorted with a vindictive politeness that was quite thrown away upon her. "Michael first," he began doggedly. "Father first," Michael said, who was of a suspicious nature. "I shall be sick, you know," Mr. Darling said threateningly. "Come on, Father," said John. "Hold your tongue, John," his father rapped out. Wendy was quite puzzled. "I thought you took it quite easily, Father." "That is not the point," he retorted. "The point is there is more in my glass than Michael's spoon." His proud heart was nearly bursting. "And it isn't fair. I would say it as though it were my last breath. It isn't fair." "Father, I am waiting," said Michael coldly. "It's all very well to say you're waiting. So am I waiting." "Father's a cowardly custard." "So are you a cowardly custard." "I'm not frightened. Neither am I." "Well, then take it." "Well, then you take it." Wendy had a splendid idea. "Why not both take it at the same time?" "Certainly," Mr. Darling said. "Are you ready, Michael?" Wendy gave the words 1, 2, 3, and Michael took his medicine, but Mr. Darling slipped his behind his back. There was a yell of rage from Michael, and "Oh, Father!" Wendy exclaimed. "What do you mean by 'oh, Father'?" Mr. Darling demanded. "Stop that row, Michael. I meant to take mine, but I missed it." It was dreadful the way all the three were looking at him, just as if they did not admire him. "Look here, all of you," he said entreatingly as soon as Nana had gone into the bathroom. "I have just thought of this splendid joke. I shall pour my medicine into Nana's bowl, and she will drink it thinking it's milk." Wait, so that hasn't happened yet? Or is this a regular thing for him to do? It was the color of milk. But the children did not have their father's sense of humor, and they looked at him reproachfully as he poured the medicine into Nana's bowl. "What fun," he said doubtfully, and they did not dare expose him when Mrs. Darling and Nana returned. "Nana, good dog," he said, patting her. "I have put a little milk into your bowl, Nana." Nana wagged her tail, ran to the medicine, and began lapping at it. Then she gave Mr. Darling such a look, not an angry look. She showed him the great red tear that makes us so sorry for noble dogs, and crept into her kennel. When you say red tear, does that just mean her eye was bloodshot, or does that mean that she's crying blood? Mr. Darling was frightfully ashamed of himself, but he would not give in. In a horrid silence, Mrs. Darling smelt the bowl. "Oh, George," she said, "it's your medicine." "It was only a joke," he roared, while she comforted her boys, and Wendy hugged Nana. "Much good," he said bitterly. "Am I wearing myself to the bone trying to be funny in this house?" And still Wendy hugged Nana. "That's right," he shouted. "Coddle her. Nobody coddles me. Oh dear, no. I'm only the breadwinner. Why should I be coddled? Why? George," Mrs. Darling entreated him. What does entreaty mean? Entreat means ask someone earnestly or anxiously to do something. Okay. Maybe I should have already known that. "George," Mrs. Darling entreated him. "Not so loud. The servants will hear you." The servants that you have even though you're poor? Maybe they mean the neighbors' servants? Or the other dogs? Somehow they had gotten into the way of calling Lisa the servants. Okay. I guess they can afford to have one servant. Excuse me, I meant to say they can afford the servants. "Let them," he roared recklessly. "Bring in the whole world. But I refuse to allow that dog to lord it in my nursery for an hour longer. Maybe 59 minutes, but not an hour." The children wept, and Nina ran to him beseechingly. But he waved her back. He felt he was a strong man again. In vain, he cried. "The proper place for you is in the yard, and there you go to be tied up this instant." George, Mrs. Darling whispered. "Remember what I told you about that boy." Alas, he would not listen. He was determined to show who was master of that house, and when commands would not draw Nana from the kennel, he lured her out of it with honeyed words, and seized her roughly, dragging her from the nursery. He was ashamed of himself, and yet he did it. It was all owing to his too affectionate nature, which craved admiration. When he had tied her up in the backyard, the wretched father went and sat in the passage, with his knuckles to his eyes. In the meantime, Mrs. Darling had put the children to bed in unwonted silence, and lit their nightlights. They could hear Nana barking, and John whimpered, "Is it because he is chaining her up in the yard?" But Wendy was wiser. "That is not Nana's unhappy bark," she said, little guessing what was about to happen. "That is her bark when she smells danger." "Danger? Are you sure, Wendy?" "Oh, yes." Mrs. Darling quivered and went to the window. It was securely fastened. She looked out, and the night was peppered with stars. They were crowned around the house, as if curious to see what was to take place there. But she did not notice this, nor that one or two of the smallest ones winked at her. Yet a nameless fear clutched at her heart, and made her cry, "Oh, how I wish that I wasn't going to a party tonight." Even Michael, already half asleep, knew that she was perturbed, and he asked, "Can anything harm us, Mother, after the night lights are lit?" "Nothing, precious," she said. "They are the eyes a mother leaves behind to guard her children." "The stars are your eyes, Mother. Next you'll be telling us that you rummage through our thoughts during the night." She went from bed to bed singing enchantments over them, and little Michael flung his arms around her. "Mother," he cried, "I'm glad of you." They were the last words she was to hear from him for a long time. Oh, so is this not all going to be condensed into one night, Chronicles of Narnia style, like the movie? I think in the movie, when they get back, their parents haven't noticed that they've been gone, so I think that for them it's only been one night. 27 was only a few yards distant, but there had been a slight fall of snow, and Father and Mother Darling picked their way over it deftly not to soil their shoes. They were already the only persons in the street, and all the stars were watching them. Stars are beautiful, but they may not take an active part in anything. They must just look on forever. It is a punishment put on them for something they did so long ago that no star now knows what it was. So the older ones have become glassy-eyed and seldom speak, winking in the star language. But the little ones still wonder, what the heck kind of abominable war led to all the stars being cursed with inaction? That sounds like a cosmic story worth reading. They are not really friendly to Peter, who had a mischievous way of stealing up behind them and trying to blow them out, but they are so fond of fun that they were on his side tonight, and anxious to get the grown-ups out of the way. So as soon as the door of 27 closed on Mr. and Mrs. Darling, there was a commotion in the firmament. Firmament? And the smallest of all the stars in the Milky Way screamed out, "Now, Peter." It has this illustration before that last page in the chapter, but I feel like it represents what happens after that page, so I'm going to show it to you now. As you can see, Peter looks a lot different than he did in the movie. His leaf clothing almost looks like a dress, and he doesn't have his iconic hat. I'm guessing that the stage play is what came up with his now iconic look. Sort of reminds me of the Wicked Witch of the West. She's not actually green in the book, and she has eye patch and much different hair, and I don't think she wears black, and she doesn't have that pointy hat. But everyone just thinks of the green version as how the Wicked Witch of the West looks. I'm gonna edit what I've recorded so far before I decide if I want to go any farther with this. Like I said, this is an experimental video, and experiments aren't always successful. So remember to like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, and not let your mother rummage through your thoughts.